So welcome to another conversation on the future of commuting with myself, Dahi de Butler. Today I'm joined by Dan Radman. How are you doing, Dan?
Good, good. Well today.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thanks a million for joining us, Dan. Do you want to just kick things off by telling everyone a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm an architect based in Connecticut in the U.S. I've been doing commercial work for past 25 years or so, working with various scales of clients, everyone from a smaller office space for an attorney up to 500,000 square feet for clients like RBS and some of the banks in the States here, both domestically in the U.S. as well as internationally. Most recently worked with Park Office on a project for a company called FactSet, who is a financial services and information provider for their corporate headquarters in Norwalk, Connecticut.
Cool, that's fantastic. So I suppose without sounding like it's a stupid question, Dan, there might be a lot of people out there listening who are kind of saying, what does an architect have to do with commuting? You want to enlighten us?
Well, it's efficiency and use of space. The FactSet project that I mentioned was really an eye-opener for myself in working with Park Office as well as the client team. I was not the primary architect on the project. I was acting more as owner's rep. There was another architect involved, but what we learned was the culture of FactSet and the way they were working significantly impacted their parking load and their parking requirements in a very different way than what they were anticipating. Granted, in all full disclosure, they moved into their space in October of 2019, and obviously COVID hit last year, so they only had a few months of full use of the space with the Park Office solution. But we did learn, even in that time, we did learn a lot about how they were using the space and how people were working within there. They inherently were a very mobile office structure. They specifically set their new headquarters up with very few, if any, private offices. Everyone had just workstations, and the majority of people had hot desks where they were logging in on a daily basis and picking a place to sit down for the day. And it did not necessarily mean they were going to be there the very next day. And what that did is established a sort of a mentality within the work culture, not only in the workspace itself, but also in the parking solutions where they were coming in. And it broke the barrier of people, how they sort of get wed to coming to work and having their preferred spot of where they're going to park for the day and, getting into a routine with that. What they came to learn and figure out was that it was much more efficient for them to work with a parking management system like the Park Office system to allocate number of spots that were available to them. And people would come in and they would be better informed as to where they could park for the day, and they weren't so wed to being in a certain level or a certain location or a certain spot. Gave them a little more flexibility, and just changed. It sort of aligned their commuting and parking mentality with the new way of working that they had established in their headquarters.
Yeah, no, it's definitely has been a really interesting project to see kind of evolve and grow. I suppose to bring it back to kind of architects for a minute. So you mentioned obviously a fundamental part of the work that you and a lot of architects do is managing space. But in the commuter, I suppose, jigsaw, I've always had architects somewhere up and around kind of HR professionals. And what I kind of mean by that is there are people who should be more proactive in relation to commuting, but they just seem to think they've more glamorous things to focus on. Is that a kind of fair critique, or would you think that slowly but surely there's this understanding that's growing that with every office you need to have I suppose, a car park that isn't just laid out with a load of spaces. It needs to be designed to
Yeah,
cater for the new way of getting to work, I suppose.
that's exactly it. I think historically there's always, and a lot of this is culture and profession driven, where as architects, we've always, when designing larger spaces, you take two things into account, right? You're trying to satisfy jurisdictional code requirements on a parking load on a per square foot basis based on an occupancy for office space. In my area in the US, most of the time it's 3 parking spots per 1,000 square feet of rentable space. And that's how much you're given by a lease, and that's how much the town usually requires, and that's how much you usually design for. Whether or not that satisfies the actual parking demand that that particular client or that facility is going to require, that's usually where the architects will default to. And what architects have learned over the years, especially dealing with more, what's the right word, more flexible or more pliable clients who are changing the way they're working, not only corporate wide, but on a daily basis in terms of, parking load per day. They've come to learn that there's much more efficient ways to structure the parking facility, manage it in terms of access points, assigned spots, non-assigned spots, and also be able to report back as to the availability, which can then inform the users as to how much space is in parking, how much space is available to them in the facility, et cetera. This FactSet project was a very eye-opening way of looking at the corporate office, because even though they were planning on somewhere between 900 and 1,000 people being quote unquote based out of that office, they weren't necessarily all working there on a daily basis. The facility was only designed to handle up to 600 people, 6 to 650 per day. That was the anticipated load, because so many of them work remotely, so many of them travel, and which would leave a lot of vacant space in the office and a lot of vacant space in the parking. And all of that data based on the client usage and the client culture is something we had to tie in together to really refine what we were doing as an office design, but also tie in as to what we were doing with a parking design to make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a fascinating project. So we were just talking before we started recording, COVID has obviously been massively disruptive for a lot of industries, but it's been very good by and large for architects.
It has, not to sound like the ambulance chaser, the lawyer chasing the ambulance after the accident kind of thing, but the architects have been put in a unique position because of COVID, because especially on the commercial side, because so much more reshuffling and redesigning of interiors has now emerged because of COVID conditions and concerns by corporate facilities as to how they're setting people up in the office space, social distancing, proximity of desks, barriers, automating and motorizing doors, creating a touchless environment. So as you come into the space, you have your proximity card, and you're not pushing on doors. They're motorized to get in. You're not going into elevators and pushing a control button. Your card swipe is giving it destination control, so it knows what floor you're going to. Everything's been sort of relooked over the last 12 months as to creating a much more touchless environment.
Yeah, no, it's good to see, I suppose, that some sectors are booming,
Yeah.
I suppose that kind of brings me to my final question, and it's one that I've asked a few and haven't really got any answers that has really sated my appetite. So I think most experts agree that moving forward, the way that offices are occupied is going to be very different. And I think most people recognize that fluid and flexible working is going to be the future. And what that means is for a lot of people, it'll be working from the office maybe 2, 3, 4 days a week and working from home the remainder. Now, where that leaves us then is potentially with large amounts of surplus office space and a working demographic who are potentially less predisposed to living in city centres because they don't need access to offices as regularly. What is going to happen with all the spare space?
It's hard to know right now. I have a number of working associates and friends who are real estate brokers in the New York City area in the States, and they're scratching their heads right now trying to figure out what some of these companies are going to be doing with this excess space. A couple of my clients are, one of them just completed over 200,000 square feet of 7 floors in Midtown New York, in New York City, and they just moved into the space a year and a half ago, and they're now looking at subdividing and subleasing a lot of their floors because they signed, a 15-year lease on the space. They're on the hook for it. The landlord's not going to let them off, so they're able to sublet it. So now they're scrambling and redesigning the spaces because the floors were designed for a single tenant occupancy, but the demand isn't there for those large sizes of floor plates and single tenant occupancies. So they're now in the process of changing, rebuilding, and reshuffling the floors to create multi-tenant situations that they can sublet. And landlords as well as tenants are being put in that position to just do something with the space and see if anyone's gonna rent it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely interesting, and long term, I suppose it'll be even more interesting in that,
I think long term, it's going to be very difficult because I would venture to say that most of the larger developers, probably worldwide, they're probably looking at additional office development in urban areas and questioning whether to even do those projects at this point, because there's going to be such a glut of office space there probably already is on the market. They're going to worry about whether to build those buildings.
Well, hopefully you'll be able to get plenty of work repurposing the old ones, regardless of whether they need new ones or not. But
yeah,
thanks a million for your time today, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely.